There was a time when the peak of San Francisco's Nob Hill was crowned by mansions so enormous, so extravagant, that they were called palaces. They were built by railroad barons and silver kings, men who had started with pennies in their pockets and conquered the West Coast. For roughly 30 years, these mansions towered over the city and outcompeted each other to be the biggest mansions in California. But what happened? Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button and let's uncover San Francisco's lost Millionaires Row. This video is brought to you in part by Victorian Society in America. More on them later. Before the cable car, Nob Hill was just another steep, windswept summit that most San Franciscans had little reason to climb. That changed in 1873, when the cable car began clattering up Clay Street, proving that a mechanical grip on a buried steel cable could haul San Franciscans up slopes that defeated horses. Suddenly, the hilltop wasn't remote anymore. It was exclusive. And in a city that had grown from a muddy outpost to a major metropolis in barely 20 years, exclusivity was exactly what the newly rich were looking for. The men who seized on Nob Hill's potential were the so-called Big Four: Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, and Collis Huntington. They had all arrived in California during the gold rush, not to pan for gold, but to sell supplies to the men who did. As merchants in Sacramento, they pooled their capital in the early 1860s to finance Theodore Judah's audacious plan for a railroad over the Sierra Nevada. The Central Pacific Railroad, chartered by Congress in 1862 to build the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, made them fabulously wealthy. By the time the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory's summit in 1869, the Big Four controlled not just the Central Pacific, but a growing network of rail lines, steamship companies, and ferry routes that gave them a near monopoly on transportation in the American West. They preferred to call themselves the Associates, but the newspapers had less flattering names. Robber Barons was the one that stuck. They triggered a land rush among San Francisco's elite. Other millionaires followed, drawn by the views and the company. Locals watching the parade of wealth creep up the hillside began calling the neighborhood Nob Hill, Nob being an old word for a conspicuously rich person, and it was quickly shortened to Nob Hill. The name first appeared in newspapers around 1876 and has never left. What arose on that hilltop was unlike anything the West Coast had ever seen. Mansion after mansion climbed skyward, each one seemingly determined to outdo the last. Built of redwood and brick and imported stone, stuffed with art collections and pipe organs and parquet floors and rooms that ordinary San Franciscans could only read about in breathless newspaper accounts. Tourists would even ride the cable car to the summit just to gawk. Leland Stanford was the first of the Big Four to plant his flag on Nob Hill, and in doing so, he essentially invented the neighborhood. After moving his family to San Francisco in 1874 to oversee the Occidental and Oriental Steamship Company, Stanford selected a prime 2-acre lot at the corner of California and Powell Streets and commissioned the prominent San Francisco architectural firm of Samuel C. Bugbee & Son to design his residence. The finished product, completed in 1876, was a massive Italianate structure, about 41,000 square feet in all, that stood as the largest private home in California. Stanford's wealth was almost incomprehensible by the standards of his day. Born in 1824 in New York, he had trained as a lawyer before heading west to sell provisions to gold rush miners. His investments in the Central Pacific Railroad transformed him from a successful merchant into one of the richest men in America, and he had also previously served as governor of California. By the time the Nob Hill mansion was finished, he was a man who moved between politics and business with an ease that made his critics uneasy and his partners even richer. The house itself was a showcase of Gilded Age ambition. Its main entrance on California Street featured a broad porch supported by 16 Corinthian columns, approached by a grand flight of marble stairs. Inside, a 100-foot-long central hall widened at its midpoint into a soaring rotunda 30 feet in diameter, rising all the way to the roof and ringed by yet more Corinthian columns. The main floor alone contained a parlor, a 55-foot art gallery, a library, a billiard room, and a dining room that measured 52 by 28 feet. And the second floor had 25 bedrooms. The interior decoration was executed by Potier & Stymus, one of New York's most prestigious design firms, and featured fresco ceilings, mosaic floors, and a lavishness that bordered on the ecclesiastical. Perhaps not content with merely being the first railroad baron on the hilltop, Stanford also wanted a cable car line that ran directly past his front door. The existing Clay Street line was only 2 blocks away, an apparently unacceptable distance for a man of his means. So Stanford simply started his own, the California Street Cable Railroad, which began operations in 1878 and remains the oldest continuously operated cable car line in San Francisco to this day. Tragedy struck the Stanfords in 1884 when their only son, Leland Jr., passed away of typhoid fever at the age of 15. The grief-stricken parents left San Francisco for their estate in Palo Alto and founded Stanford University in their son's memory. The Nob Hill mansion became something of a shrine. A newspaper reporter visiting the abandoned house noted that in young Leland's old bedroom, overlooking the bay, all of his boyhood belongings remained undisturbed and the blinds were never drawn. If Leland Stanford's house was a nod of refined power, Charles Crocker's mansion was a punch. Crocker had been the Big Four's construction boss, the man who oversaw the actual building of the Central Pacific Railroad through some of the most brutal terrain on the continent, driving his crews through Sierra blizzards and over sheer granite cliffs. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall and 300 pounds, and he wanted a house to match. Crocker began acquiring lots on the block bounded by California, Sacramento, Taylor, and Jones Streets in 1874, roughly a block uphill from the Stanford mansion. He hired the same architectural firm, Bugbee & Son, to design a residence in the Second Empire style, complete with a towering mansard roof and a central observation tower that rose 75 feet above the street, giving Crocker a commanding view of the entire city. The house was enormous, around 25,000 square feet, and its interior was finished with parquet floors and frescoed ceilings. But the Crocker mansion is remembered less for its architecture than for the most famous neighborhood feud in San Francisco history. Crocker wanted his estate to encompass the entire city block, and he had bought out every property owner on it, all except one. Nicholas Young, a German-born undertaker, owned a modest cottage on the northeast corner. Young and his wife enjoyed the views and the sunshine and had no desire to leave. Crocker reportedly offered around $6,000 to buy it, but Young wanted more. When negotiations collapsed, Crocker did something astonishing. He ordered his workers to build a solid wooden fence 40 feet high around the sides of Young's property, blocking out the sunlight, the views, and most of the fresh air. Of all the palaces that crowned Nob Hill, the Mark Hopkins mansion was the one that seemed most likely to have been conjured from a fantasy. It was enormous, ornate, vaguely Gothic, and depending on who you asked, either magnificent or absolutely ridiculous. It occupied the southwestern corner of California and Mason Streets, just one block uphill from the Stanford residence, and it dominated the skyline of the entire neighborhood. The tower was, for a time, the highest point in all of San Francisco, a fact that photographer Edward Muybridge exploited in 1877, when he chose it as the vantage point for his famous panoramic photograph of the city. Mark Hopkins himself was the quietest and most frugal of the Big Four. Born in 1813 in Henderson, New York, he had come to California during the gold rush and gone into business with Collis Huntington, selling hardware and mining supplies to prospectors out of a Sacramento storefront. Hopkins served as the treasurer of the Central Pacific Railroad, the meticulous bookkeeper who kept track of the money while his latter partners spent it. He was known for simple taste, careful habits, and a deep reluctance to part with a dollar he didn't have to. He did not especially want a mansion, but his wife Mary did, and Hopkins reportedly told her she could build whatever she pleased. The result was a 40-room Gothic castle designed by the English-born San Francisco architects Wright and Sanders that took approximately 3 years to build at a cost reported to be around $1.5 million, a staggering sum at the time. Hopkins never got to enjoy any of it. He passed away in 1878, just before the house was finished, leaving his wife an estimated $60 to $70 million and stock holdings that generated roughly $1 million per year in income. Mary moved in briefly, then relocated to the East Coast, where she built another enormous mansion in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and eventually married her interior designer, Edward Searles, who was 30 years her junior. After Mary's death in 1891, Searles, who had inherited the entire Hopkins fortune, donated the Nob Hill mansion to the University of California and Trust for the San Francisco Art Association. For the next 13 years, the Gothic castle that Mary Hopkins built to impress San Francisco society served a rather different purpose, as the Mark Hopkins Institute of Art, housing classrooms, studios, and galleries. The Huntington mansion on Nob Hill has a peculiar distinction among the Big Four residences. Collis Huntington didn't actually build it. The house at the corner of Taylor was originally constructed in the early 1870s for David Colton, the chief legal counsel of the Central Pacific Railroad and a man sometimes called the half of the Big Four and a half. Colton hired the same architectural firm as the others, the seemingly inescapable Bugbee and Son, to design a two-story neoclassical residence with Roman composite detailing on the first floor, fronted by a handsome marble step portico flanked by carved Italian marble lions. Colton's tenure in the house was brief. In 1878, he was thrown from a horse, which then fell on him, and surgery in the 1800s left something to be desired, and long story short, he passed away. This triggered a cascade of lawsuits between his widow Ellen and the Big Four. Ellen Colton believed Stanford, Hopkins, Crocker, and Huntington had swindled her husband out of company securities. They countersued, claiming Colton had committed fraud against the railroad. The legal battle dragged on for years, producing 24 volumes of court testimony and generating enormous gossip in the San Francisco press. After much of the Colton estate had been, as one newspaper put it, frittered away in legal fees, the Huntington family purchased the property in 1892 for $250,000. Collis Huntington, however, had little use for the house. By the 1890s, he was based primarily in New York, leaving the mansion empty for all but maybe a week or two out of the year. James Flood was not a railroad man, he was a Silver King, and his mansion on Nob Hill was different from the others in almost every way that mattered. Where the Big Four built in wood and hoped nobody would notice, Flood built in stone. Flood was born on Staten Island in 1826 to Irish immigrant parents and received an 8th grade education before apprenticing to a carriage maker. He sailed for San Francisco in 1849, tried his hand at the goldfields with modest success, and eventually opened the Auction Lunch Saloon on Washington Street with his partner William S. O'Brien. The saloon became a gathering place for mining speculators, and Flood, who had a sharp ear for gossip and a sharper mind for finance, began investing in silver mining stocks. In 1873, he and O'Brien joined forces with John Mackay and James Fair to form the Consolidated Virginia Mining Company, which struck the legendary Big Bonanza vein in Nevada's Comstock Lode. The discovery was one of the largest silver strikes in American history, and it made all four men spectacularly rich. They became known as the Bonanza Kings, and Flood, the former saloon keeper with an 8th grade education, was suddenly one of the wealthiest men in the country. But the question still remains, what happened to these magnificent mansions? Before we find out, a quick word from the sponsor of today's video, Victorian Society in America. Are you captivated by historic architecture? Want to explore, learn, and dive even deeper into the past? With the Victorian Society in America, you'll have the chance to travel to American cities and tour stunning 19th century buildings, pursue learning through internationally acclaimed summer programs in American cities and abroad, including Chicago, Newport, and London to name a few. Additionally, members will enjoy a free subscription to 19th Century, the semi-annual publication packed with articles on art, architecture, preservation awards, and book reviews. Visit the website below in the video description and become part of the Victorian Society in America today. Thank you, Victorian Society in America, for sponsoring this video. Now back to Nob Hill. At 5:12 a.m. on the morning of April 18, 1906, the San Andreas Fault ruptured along a stretch of nearly 300 miles, and the most devastating earthquake in American history struck San Francisco. The initial shaking lasted between 45 and 60 seconds, toppled chimneys, buckled streets, and brought entire buildings down into the streets below. But the earthquake was only the beginning. What destroyed San Francisco and what destroyed Nob Hill was fire. Ruptured gas mains ignited blazes across the city that the fire department was powerless to control, because the same earthquake had shattered the water mains. With no water pressure to fight the flames, fire swept through neighborhood after neighborhood, burning for 3 days and consuming roughly 80% of the city. The inferno climbed Nob Hill on the second day of the disaster, and the palaces that had loomed over the city for 3 decades were reduced to ash in mere hours. The Stanford Mansion, all 50 rooms, the Corinthian Rotunda, the frescoed ceilings, young Leland's undisturbed bedroom burned to its granite foundation walls. The Hopkins Mansion, which had been serving as the Mark Hopkins Institute of Art, was consumed entirely, its elaborate Gothic woodwork providing ready fuel. The Crocker Mansion and its adjoining spite fence, both long since landmarks of Gilded Age excess, were reduced to rubble. The Huntington house, its painted wood exterior offering no resistance to the advancing wall of flame, was gutted. All of Nob Hill's great wooden palaces were gone, all except one. The James Flood Mansion, with its thick brownstone walls shipped all the way from Connecticut, refused to fall. The interior was consumed by the fire, but the stone shell held. When the smoke cleared and San Franciscans began taking stock of the devastation, the Flood Mansion's scorched but standing walls were among the only structures on the hilltop that remained upright. Flood's daughter, Cora Jane, sold the fire-scarred property to the Pacific Union Club in 1909. The club hired architect Willis Polk to rebuild and expand the structure, adding a third floor and semicircular wings on either side, all faced in matching brownstone sourced from the same Connecticut quarry that had supplied the original stone. The destruction of Nob Hill's mansions was total and swift, but the neighborhood rebuilt on the bones of the old. The mansions of Nob Hill stood for barely a generation, from the mid-1870s to 1906, a span of roughly 30 years. In that brief window, they represented the Gilded Age ambitions on the American West Coast, impossible wealth and possible houses, built by men who had risen from nothing and believed their fortunes would last forever. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Which of these mansions was your favorite? Let me know down below in the comments section. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Victorian Society in America for sponsoring this video. Check out their link in the video description to find out how you can get involved today. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time on This House.